Okay, so as you know, paper one is made up of 3 questions. You'll get 1 question on microeconomics, 1 question on macroeconomics, and a question on global economy. Now, most students favour either question 1 micro or question 2 macro, and this particular example is from macroeconomics. So again, it's just a way of scaffolding an essay for you to see how you would structure it. And often the structure that I'm using here with this macroeconomic essay can be exactly the same for any macroeconomic essay that you might answer. So the question you can see in the middle is evaluate the effectiveness of interventionist supply side policies in reducing demand pull inflation. So we're very aware of very specific terms in here. It's interventionist supply side policies rather than market based, and it's demand pull inflation rather than cost push. So very specific. Looking at our introduction, again, don't just make a list of definitions, use some narrative, provide context, explain the question, scope, real world example, and explaining the question will help you give your definitions. If you're desperate to put in a definition, which you don't have to, but you are supposed to use terminology effectively. So what I've written here by way of introduction is it's a macroeconomics one. I can often start any macroeconomics question exactly the same way. I could prepare it in advance in anticipation of their macroeconomic question. So I've written any government has a number of macroeconomic objectives, including growth, low unemployment, low inflation. Here's my opportunity to say what inflation is. It's the percentage change in price levels over a given period of time. And a 2% target is fairly common. Trying to show off a little bit of knowledge around the subject is always helpful. And then go on to say about governments have got a number of policies that they might use in order to help achieve these goals, one of which is an interventionist supply side policies, deliberate government action to try and impact the long run output in an economy. And also at this opportunity now bring in a real world example. It's got one up my sleeve, is a sort of well-known illustration of supply side in the UK in the 1980s. The government of that time heavily relied upon supply side policies in order to try and control inflation, which in 1980 was around about 18%. I might also then just come back to the scope of my essay. If I rewrite the question at this point, this essay will attempt to evaluate the effectiveness. You can rewrite the question just to help focus your mind on the answer. I'm coming across now to my main analysis. My main analysis should initially support the question. The question is about how the effectiveness of interventionist supply side policies. So let's start with saying that, yes, they are effective, and here's why. So I'll go into the economic analysis of it, explain interventionist policies. I'll use a diagram. I could do 2 here because I can show a diagram with demand pull inflation, straightforward aggregate supply, aggregate demand diagram. And I can then also show supply side policies diagram, long run aggregate supply curve shifting to the right. I've chosen to try and combine the 2 things into one. It's a sort of slightly unusual diagram perhaps, but it saves me drawing 2. What I'm showing is that initially, where you've got a situation of aggregate demand being quite strong, we might find prices going up initially at that period of time. But if I can shift the long run aggregate supply curve sufficiently to the right through my supply side policies, I can get to a new equilibrium that is actually at a much lower level of prices than I was before. I sort of brought down inflation. And we're also trying to make sure I link to my real world example. Right? So I've got to come back to my real world example as frequently as possible. So again, my real world example is the UK. Remember, you don't just have to have one. Don't rely on just one real world example in your essays. If you want to use a number of different examples from around the world to make a point, that's absolutely fine. I'm just focusing on the UK. They increased flexibility in their labour markets and managed to bring inflation down from 18% in 1980 to around about 4% by 1986 over that 6-year period. I then come to my evaluation. It's the most important part. So I'm about halfway through at this point, and my evaluation needs to take up the rest of my essay. And here I discuss the extent to which the policy is going to be effective, because that's what the question is answered. not necessarily trying to make too many points. I've really only got 3 points that I want to focus on. One is that interventionist policies are long term. They can't deal with inflation immediately. Like, it wasn't straight away that the UK managed to get their inflation down to 6%. It took 6 years, and a lot can happen in that period of time, and not least politically, the government sort of losing confidence amongst the electorate. And can a government wait, therefore? Can it rely just on supply side policies, interventionist ones, in order to achieve its goal of low inflation when it's under pressure? Try and bring my real world examples back into that every time as well. My second point is that interventionist policies involve increased spending by the government. Very often, if they're spending money on infrastructure or training schemes, education, health, it's potentially quite a large level of spending. Well, that could increase aggregate demand. Aggregate demand, C plus I plus G, there's the G bit there, can push aggregate demand further out in the short run, actually make the problem even worse. So also it leads to debt. The government needs to be able to finance this increased spending, and that may be difficult in a situation where they've got sort of high inflation. So I want to elaborate on these points rather than just sort of deal with them very succinctly in 1 or 2 sentences. I want to sort of draw it out a bit. If I've got time, I'll then bring in consideration of other policies as well. This question doesn't say, is it the most effective? Where you see questions that have got most effective, the word most, then you must definitely consider other policies. This one doesn't say that. It's just asking whether this interventionist policy is effective. But even so, I can still talk about other policies that the government might use in order to deal with this problem. Finally, coming to my conclusions, very quick, nothing new. I don't want to bring in any new information in here. And again, I'll sit on the fence. Like most of my essays, I'm going to gravitate towards sitting on the fence. Interventionist policies, yes, they can be effective for these reasons in these circumstances. However, there are potentially problems with them, as I've outlined in my essay. And then I've completed my essay as usual in around about 45 minutes, because this is a part B question that I'm answering.